afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for taking your time out of your busy schedules, especially this time of year, to join us today for our first producer webinar put on by PSE. We are so excited to have all of you here with us today. My name is Sydney Fortier, and I'm the Stakeholder Engagement Technical Advisor at the Canadian Cattlemen's Association. I'm also joined today by my teammates, Amy Peck and Lindsay Beavers, who make up the rest of the Public and Stakeholder Engagement team. So just a bit of background on the Public and Stakeholder Engagement Program. Part of PSE's mandate is to bring industry players together, share consistent messaging, and provide engagement opportunities so that the industry is projecting an amplified and unified voice. We also strive to engage and inspire producers like yourselves to share your stories. This in turn creates public trust and positive sentiment surrounding the beef industry. We are hoping with our webinar series, we can shed light on hot topics and current issues facing the industry and work together to create a sustainable future for Canadian beef. So today, our presentation will be on the realities of cellular protein, given by Dr. Tim McAllister. So just a background on Dr. Tim McAllister. He grew up on his parents' cow-calf farm in Innisfil, Alberta. He obtained a Bachelor of Science and Master of Science from the University of Alberta and a PhD in ruminant nutrition and microbiology from the University of Guelph. Dr. McAllister has been a research scientist in rumen microbiology, feed, and nutrition since 1997. His research focuses on microbiology, nutrition and beef production, and on food and environmental safety issues related to livestock production, strategies for mitigation of E. coli 0157, prion inactivation within the environment, antimicrobial resistance in bacteria in feedlots, and investigating the discovery and characterization of fibrolytic enzymes from rumen microbes. He also has extensive research experience in greenhouse gas emissions within animals from manure and the impact of manure handling procedures, such as composting on emissions. Dr. McAllister has been recognized internationally for his leadership role, and we are very excited to have him here today. So following the presentation from Dr. McAllister, we will open the floor up to questions. So we ask you, as the presentation is going on, to please submit your questions, any questions you may have, through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You should just be able to click on the Q&A, and then a toolbar will appear at the, the toolbar is at the bottom of your screen. Click on the Q&A, and then a window should pop up where you can type in and then submit your answer. You will be able to see all the questions that you have answered, but they will not be able to be seen by other viewers until that question has been asked. So again, any questions that you have, we highly encourage you to ask. And then at the end, we will get to as many as we can. However, we will limit the duration of this entire webinar to 1 hour. So with that, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Tim McAllister.
Thanks, Sydney. So thanks a lot for the opportunity. Today I'm going to talk about cellular meat and is it truly an alternative to livestock protein sources? Now, I'm not an expert in tissue culture. We have used some cellular models in our laboratory when we're testing out the various degrees of pathogenicity that some bacteria may have, but I haven't cultured meat myself in my own lab. It's a pretty technical process. Most of the expertise in that area has come from what you've heard about the stem cells and the use of those technologies in regenerative medicine. So a lot of that is where the greatest expertise in the world would lie today. So producing meat is sort of a different story and a different application of that technology that was really developed within the medical field. So there is a lot of protein that comes from livestock in the world, probably around 75, 78 million tons right now of protein originate from livestock production systems globally. There's a lot of that protein that's produced in North America and in South America, as you can see here in terms of the tonnage, and also in Europe, and then a large amount produced in Asia as well. The distribution of those various protein sources also vary depending upon the region of the world. Beef production is particularly predominant in both North and South America, whereas if you go to China, there's a lot more poultry and swine consumed there as well. But some of those dynamics in terms of consumption are changing over time as well. For example, beef consumption is increasing in China quite a bit as well. For the most part, in the developing nations, the developed nations, livestock or meat production or meat protein consumption from meat-based products are really at a plateau or relatively steady. It's really in the developing world where we're seeing a big expansion, and that's just sort of illustrated here. So we expect that by 2050, there will be an increase from that 75 to 80 million metric tons to 200 metric tons in terms of global meat consumption. So when we look at that growing demand, we really, in order to meet the requirements of humanity, we're going to have to look at all methods or mechanisms of way from livestock, plants, and potentially cellular based meat as well. But what you'll see from my presentation that there's definitely still some challenges with that approach. So if we look at what the current consumption is, livestock now in terms of total protein sources for humans, it provides about 36% of that. 9% comes from seaweed, and 55% still comes from plant-based sources. And then there's others of which things like insect and even the meat alternatives would fall into as being very minor at this point. The value of the livestock and seafood in itself is about $1.2 trillion per year. And if you compare that to like plant-based alternatives for meat products, they're about 4.5 billion and hopefully to reach 8.3 billion by 2025. Now, I'm sure we've all noticed an increase in those plant-based alternatives. We do see them in the grocery store now, and many of the fast food restaurants are also offering them on their menu. I just heard some recent information that sales for those, though, are relatively steady. From what I've heard, they're not expanding as much as obviously the people who developed those technologies were hoping at this point in time. But we've definitely seen a much more predominance of those, at least in our grocery stores, than we would have seen like 5 years ago. Single cell proteins are another source of proteins. Those are algae, bacteria, or yeast. They've been around for a very long time. The value of that market's about $12 billion. So any of the fermentation processes that we're talking about would rely on those single cell proteins for the fermentation process. And we can grow bacteria in vats, and if you want, you can consume those bacteria as well, as long as they're not pathogenic or have any toxins. So, but that really hasn't, acted as a replacement for livestock or plant-based proteins to any significant extent. And then there's interest in insects, which are being commercially produced now, relatively small market there as well. A lot of that is going into fish food or alternative protein sources. We can get cricket powder in the grocery stores now, which are basically ground up cricket protein as another process. And then there's cultured meat. At this point, there isn't cultured meat that's available in the grocery stores. There is one product that was marketed. It was a chicken nugget based cultured meat product that was being marketed in Singapore. But at this point, the overall market is really not developed, and it's really at a lab bench to a scale up point in the production. It's not commercially available yet. So if we look at the plant-based alternatives that we have heard quite a bit, they're typically produced either on a soy-based or a pea-based alternative in terms of the protein that's being derived from those plant-based sources. And if you look at the nutrient profile of those relative to ground beef, that in this case, this soybean-based alternative has a profile that's quite similar to that of ground beef, but that's because they've fortified a lot of those components into that mixture when they generated the plant-based alternative. If you compare that to the pea-based product, you can see it's lacking a lot of those other components. That's because this product hasn't been fortified. So things like vitamin B12, which rely on basically it's the bacteria within the intestinal tract of the animal that produces that vitamin B12, which is then absorbed across the intestinal tract and deposited in the ground meat. Is a very important source of that essential vitamin. With a soy-based alternative, you don't have that, so they have to add the vitamin B12 artificially. Now, one of the big advantages that they proclaim and with regard to plant-based alternatives is that they have a much lower carbon footprint, about 3.2 to 3.5 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of plant-based protein as compared to a range of 10.2 to 48, depending upon the beef production system that you're talking about. Often those estimates, though, do not include the carbon that was released when that land was originally cultivated in order to grow those crops. It assumes that the land has already been cultivated. And so that carbon is often not taken into context within those types of LCA analysis. And obviously they also don't consider the carbon sequestration that can occur as a benefit of grassland ecosystems that are associated with beef cattle production. Now, cellular meat was thought about quite some time ago. Back in as early as 1927, there were people referring to it, to the possibility of producing cellular meat. There wasn't really any significant research going on at that time. It wasn't until the late 1990s with the characterization and the science around stem cells and the developments in regenerative medicine. We had a number of patents that were placed in it at that time. And of course, there's been a huge exponential development around stem cells and regenerative medicine in terms of the potential of that for things like tissue grafts and organ replacement, et cetera. And as I mentioned, that's where the majority of the research investment is taking place now, is still in the medical community. Now, in 2013, Mark Post in the Netherlands was the first to develop the first burger. And you probably heard a lot about that back then. There was a lot of press release around that when that occurred. That was the first cellular meat product that was produced. And then towards the end of 2020, that Singapore chicken nugget that I mentioned was also developed and marketed in Singapore by a company called Eat Just, or first to actually have a commercial product. Now that hasn't, as far as I know, that hasn't expanded much beyond that. It's still small. So for the most part, we could say that the market for cellular meat is still in development and it isn't commercially available at this time. So how do we produce cultured meat? Well, the production of cultured meat does not get rid of the animal. So this is not vegan or vegetarian. It wouldn't meet those classifications because it still relies on an animal in order to produce the muscle cells, which are then extracted to and processed to develop these myogenic satellite cells that we call them, which are then introduced into a bioreactor. And within that bioreactor, those cells are growing in the presence of oxygen. So this is an aerobic process. It's not a fermentation process. So they have to continuously pump oxygen into the system to provide the oxygen that's required for those cells to divide and multiply. Now they can also produce those from embryonic stem cells, but the problem with that is that the growth of the embryonic stem cells are not as efficient as the growth is from these myogenic satellite cells. So for the most part, most of these products that are being developed are using this stream where a muscle biopsy is taken. Those muscle cells are subjected to an enzymes and basically a breakdown procedure to isolate the individual myogenic satellite cells. And then those are mixed with a nutrient broth within a bioreactor in order to proliferate those cells, which then fuse together on a structure to form these myotubes. They will self-assemble, and then those myotubes can be then assembled into muscle fibers. Now, the nutrient broth itself does have some really important ingredients, and one of those is what we call fetal bovine serum, and it contains a lot of the nutrients and the hormones and the various cofactors that are required to promote the growth of those satellite cells. And really the absolute ratios and composition of all of those components is not entirely known. And so that's why by taking a complex solution like fetal bovine serum, which contains all of those various growth factors, they can use that to more efficiently then grow those muscle cells. The problem with that is that fetal bovine serum is worth about $1,800 a liter. And that's one of the reasons why it's so expensive to produce these cells in these bioreactors. Now, the myotubes then can assemble into the muscle fibers, and then those muscle fibers can be ground to form the burger. But you'll see in this little diagram that I've got here that we're talking all about ground meat. We're not talking about producing steaks or roasts here. Muscle is much more complex, and intact muscle is much more complex than these muscle fibers or the myotubes. So at this point, that's why when you've seen a lot of these releases, they're always talking about meatballs or sausage or burgers, because these muscle fibers lack the structure and integrity of an intact muscle. So producing a steak or a roast is beyond the ability to do that right now with the current technologies. They're working on trying to develop that, but there's a number of limitations to that. So this just shows a little more complexity about what a muscle itself looks like. And even this is a simplified version. So the muscle fibers that I talked about originally are these little round circles you see that are within the overall muscle. And you can see there's a number of these complexes that are put together that then form the muscle. And then those fibers are in turn connected into connective tissue, as well as tendons, which then will be connected to the bone. And the stretching and the movement of the muscle itself will affect the development of these muscle fibers. We've all heard about, going and working out in the gym and building muscle. Well, you are splitting or breaking those muscle fibers when you're lifting those weights. That's how you build muscles. And those satellite cells that I talked about are the cells that prepare, along with some other cells as well, that participate in the repair of that muscle and the building of that muscle back. So muscle is not static in terms of its composition and traits. It evolves over time depending upon how much it's worked, what the age of the animal is, what the diet is. All of those factors can influence the quality of the muscle that you end up getting. The other connective tissue, which is the endomysium, the epimysium, which surrounds the outer part of the muscle, and the perimysium, which is within these bundles of muscle fibers, also influence the structure of the muscle. And so synthesizing that in those bioreactors is extremely difficult to do. In fact, it's presently not achievable. A lot of this protein that we're talking about here is collagen. So producing that protein is difficult in these bioreactors. They've talked about doing it transgenically using transgenic plants or other methods of producing that protein and cellular expansion, like in some of those bacteria or the yeast that I mentioned with. But of course, the more you have to do that, the more it adds to the complexity of the process in terms of then reassembling that back together in order to make the complete muscle. The other limitation that we have is that there are also blood vessels that are penetrating throughout the muscle that deliver both the oxygen and the nutrients that the muscles cells need for growth and division and repair. And typically now within these bioreactor systems, the distance of which those nutrients or oxygen will diffuse into those tissues is about 0.5 millimeter. So any thicker than that, and as a result, then the oxygen or the nutrients will not be able to reach the muscle cells. And as a result, they will go into a state of necrosis and basically die. So that's another limitation is lacking those blood vessels. Likewise with the fat deposition. So adipocytes are an important part of that picture. We already, we grade one of the key grading factors of the meat we do now produce in livestock is the marbling. So that is intramuscular fat. And so you need to have adipocytes in order to produce that fat. They sequester the fatty acids and produce the fat and deposit and create that intramuscular fat that we see, and the extramuscular fat that we see as well in our various meat cuts. And then finally, the muscle also has neurons within it, the nerve fibers, and the electrical stimulation that occurs as a result of contraction and movement of that muscle can also influence the development of these muscle fibers. So all of those components are missing from cultured meat. And that's why we see sort of a simplistic form of cultured meat, which is just these muscle fibers, which at this point is, in terms of presenting it as a potential eatable product, that's why it's presented as being hamburger or sausage or meatballs. So what can they produce? What are the potential sources for producing cellular meat? Well, it's pretty much unlimited. If they can isolate those muscle satellite cells in a biopsy or potentially use the stem cells that I mentioned, they can produce that cultured meat from just about any source. And this is just a distribution of companies' current investments in beef, poultry, pork are the main ones, but there's a lot of investment in seafood as well as a method of lowering the pressure on our wild fish populations. But they've also done horses, kangaroos, mice. Some of these are looking at for pet food or the fish aquaculture industry as well as potential sources. So it's pretty much unlimited in terms of what the potential sources could be. Now, the media that I was talking about that you need to grow these cells in could differ depending upon the source that you select. The nutrient requirements to sustain and have those muscle cells reproduce may differ depending upon the original source from which those muscle cells were derived. So that could have to be curtailed specifically to each type of cultured meat product that you were producing. So this just looks at the investment across the continuum. So there's a number of different companies that have invested and are startups associated with the development of cultured meat. The greatest investment is in beef and poultry, about $181 million, and Memphis Meats is a big part of that. That's the group, I think, that also acquired investments from Cargill and Tyson as well. And you can see they account for the majority, but there are others that are looking at different sources as well, and a variety of different startups that are in place. Now, if you compare that to the amount of investment in the plant-based alternatives that we see in the grocery store, there's about $16 billion in investment in there. And that area, it continues to grow much faster than what the cellular meat market does. Where do these companies located? Well, a lot of them are in Silicon Valley, where there's lots of venture capital as well. There's also quite a few in Israel as well. The company that was just recently claimed to be able to produce the steak I mentioned too, which if you look at it, if you check it out on the internet, it doesn't look very much like a steak, but that's where that company originated from, is in Israel, that is moving towards or trying to move towards that more complex meat-based technology. But they are scattered throughout Europe as well. There's even a company, a startup in Calgary that was focusing on seafood solution or seafood production as well. I think they were at very early stages as well. So this is just outlining then the potential growth in the cultured meat market going through to 2032. So there's an opportunity for it to double. How much that will catch on? A lot of that market is in North America and in Europe. As you can see, most of those startups, though, there's not as many startups in Europe as there is in North America or in Israel. So that advancement could take place. Obviously, it'll depend a lot on how much they can lower the cost of production and what consumer acceptance will look like as well. That first burger that they produced cost about $325,000 to produce. And that's because of the complexity of that nutrient media that I talked about mainly. So all of the material was coming from medical grade suppliers. So it's extremely expensive to use that as a source of media for production of these cultured based meats. They claim to have that reduced down to $12 now. Obviously, there is opportunity for improvements to be made. Some companies are claiming that they can now produce the cultured meat with just plant-based media, not using any products at all from animals. I'm a bit skeptical about whether that's possible or not, or if it is possible, that it wouldn't have a negative impact on cell yield, because many of those growth factors that I talked about are specific to animal systems. They're not present in plant-based systems. And also plant-based systems would require quite a bit of purification, because they can have a lot of secondary compounds in them as well that may interfere with the growth of the cells and could potentially be toxic as well to the cells during that growth process. So, you know, they definitely, the industry sees the cost as a major obstacle. They're going to want to reduce that as much as possible. And so talking about having plant-based systems or moving towards plant-based media systems would be a way that they could advocate that. But whether it's in fact happening or not without having any detrimental impacts on cell yield in those production systems is still to be seen. So they're hoping to get it, you know, down to that $12. Right now, that's comparable to beef at $3 to $4 per pound. So they still got quite a ways to go, even if that $12 is correct. Now, one of the big things they advocate with regard to moving towards cell cultured meat is the reduction in the carbon footprint and the better interrelationship with the environment that the cultured meat has relative to beef cattle production or other livestock production systems. And that really depends on how you look at the system itself. So if you look at industrial energy use, which is really, at this point, we're talking primarily fossil fuel use, the amount of fossil fuel use associated with the production of in vitro meat could actually be larger than what it is for beef production or other livestock systems. And that's because of the infrastructure that's required to build the factories, the cement, the steel, all of the bioreactors that would have to be produced, the size of the factories that would have to be constructed to produce that much meat, 75 million metric tons, as well as the heating of the bioreactors, the cleaning of the bioreactors, all of those things that require fossil fuels. The indoor nature of those factories would result in an increase in that level of energy use relative to extensive beef productions, particularly if we're out on rangelands, the amount of fossil fuels those systems use. And then if we move into the global warming potential, so that's the kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents that we talk about per kilogram of product, then beef is larger mainly because of the methane emissions that are associated with fermentation within the rumen. The culture-based, cell culture-based system do not produce methane. They only produce the carbon dioxide. And there could be some potentially nitrous oxide emission. Now, if you go into some of those other methods of producing the media that I talked about, such as going back into cropping systems and using that to produce some of those components of the media, then you would have nitrous oxide emissions associated with the cropping systems. So that's why there's a lot of variability in this estimate as well, depending upon what the nature of the system is that you design to undertake the culturing process. Eutrophication potential. So the eutrophication potential is related to nutrient runoff, basically, or excessive nutrients entering the environment, like nitrogen and phosphorus. In this case, they're measuring phosphorus. So there can be phosphorus produced from beef cattle production systems. We know that we have phosphorus in the manure that we apply. We need to apply that onto the land to match crop requirements. If those nutrients are properly managed and they don't come in contact with water bodies, then they don't cause eutrophication. There is no data really available now for a eutrophication associated with cultured meat because there hasn't been enough work done in the area. But we know that those cell bioreactor systems that I'm talking to there, they're not going to be 100% efficient in terms of the use of the nutrients in those bioreactors either. No cellular system is 100% efficient in terms of nutrient utilization. And those cells will also produce end products as a result of their metabolism during growth as well. So that media will be spent after a period of time and needs to be refurbished. And that media, spent media, it depends on what happens to it. Is it purified and the nutrients extracted out of it and utilized, which would lead to increased cost? Or does that represent a waste stream that could potentially cause eutrophication as well? So those things need to be worked out with regard to cellular production as well. And then the one that's advocated probably the most is the land use, and that you're really talking about producing cellular meat within a factory, what we describe as true factory farming, versus beef production system, which, yes, we have our intensive feedlots and there's cropping systems that provide feed to those feedlots, but we also have very large grassland systems that are maintained in terms of their ability to produce beef as well. And that would represent the largest portion of that land use that's illustrated there would be the extensive rangelands that support the beef herds. So what about if we model some of those effects? So this is just some work that we use the life cycle analysis system, our LCA approach, in order to estimate the emissions that are associated with various systems. This was some work that was done by Lynch and Pirtingham not very long ago. They looked at 4 culture-based systems that differed in their carbon footprint, ranging from 1.6 to a high one that was 25 CO2 equivalents per kilogram of produced product. And then they also compared that to 3 different ranches that also varied in their amount of carbon that they produced per kilogram of beef. These high emission ones would be ones that would use a heating system with a higher cellular yield in a pharmaceutical type plant that would meet the regulatory requirements that would be required to potentially produce that cellular product. So if we look at that, then what's the implications for the warming potential? Well, we know that in the ruminant production system, as I mentioned earlier, methane accounts for the majority of those emissions because of the enteric fermentation that goes on within the rumen. Nitrous oxide would be next, which would be related to the nitrogen excretion in the urine or in the feces. And that nitrous oxide emission can be balanced by balancing that nitrogen excretion to crop requirements. And then carbon dioxide is the lowest. If we compare that to the cultured system, it's all carbon dioxide that contributes to those emissions, very little methane or nitrous oxide, just that little bit that I mentioned, depending upon how the cultured systems are produced. The beef systems can differ dramatically as well, depending upon the intensification. Typically, more extensive systems will contribute more carbon dioxide per kilogram of beef produced. But that can differ a lot depending upon the rangeland conditions, etc. So we do see variability amongst beef production systems. And we also see differences in cell cultures, as you can see here. Now, this culture D had the highest emissions. And when you compare that to all systems, it had emissions that were higher than that of even the beef production systems. Now, this is over a 1,000-year time period. And because carbon dioxide persists in the atmosphere for so long, about 1,000 years, is its half-life, it has a much greater impact on the warming potential as compared to carbon dioxide, or as compared to nitrous oxide or methane. Methane has a much shorter half-life, about 12 years, 10 to 12 years in the atmosphere. So that's why these beef production systems are much lower than this high emission cultured system when you look at it over a longer time period. And this just illustrates that same component where you have an increase in meat consumption. So the emissions associated with the global warming increase in those systems as meat consumption goes up. They go down as meat consumption declines, but the cultured system stays high because of the persistence of that CO2 in the atmosphere and its contribution to the warming potential. And then the context of those emissions also need to be considered as well. Typically, we'll see this feedlot finishing in beef with its higher emissions, again, mainly because of the methane, and they'll compare that to soy-based or plant or pea-based alternative systems, but they often fail to recognize the carbon sequestration or carbon storage that can occur in those extensive grassland ecosystems that actually, if you model some of those where you convert a cropping-based system into a perennial forage-based system, you can actually have the beef cattle production system become a net sink for carbon as well, which you would not see in a cultured-based system. Now, these are just some of, just going to summarize some of the advantages that the cultured-based meat people will say will have over conventional livestock production systems. And I've touched on many of these. So the environmental pollution piece depends on how those nutrients are managed. If they're properly managed within within livestock production systems, they actually are a form of fertilizer and do not pose a source of environmental pollution. And then when it comes to the meat processing, we need to think about the waste streams that are going to arise from those factories as well, and to what extent those are going to be processed and reutilized and recycled. The greenhouse gas emissions, we talked about those in terms of the methane emissions, and that the meat processing or the cultured meat is going to focus on carbon dioxide as the primary emission source. Now, that may be offset if we come up with renewable energy sources like solar or wind, and that provides the energy that's used in order to produce the meat. But as we know, we've got a ways to go before we can replace fossil fuels as it stands today. And those obviously would also have to be at no increased cost in terms of the production of the cultured meat, because it's already really expensive. They also advocate that it's going to reduce the loss of genetic diversity. I would argue that actually the opposite of this. It's estimated, like Mark Post, the fellow who did the first burger, he estimated that we could produce all of the beef in the world with 33,000 animals globally if we used culture-based meat systems. That's obviously going to result in a dramatic decrease in our beef cattle population around the world. And I'd say that that's going to lower our genetic diversity, because those are likely to be located in developed countries where they have more money to build factories. And it'll reduce the diversity we have in some of our more extensive rangelands and other areas of the world where we need that genetic diversity within our herds in order for them to be efficient within the various ecosystems that they reside. Soil erosion due to animal grazing. Well, we know, as I mentioned, that actually perennial forages can be preventative against both wind and water erosion. So it depends on the type of grazing. Overgrazing is not good, but moderate grazing is actually seen to be beneficial in terms of improving carbon capture through photosynthesis with the regrowth of the plants, as well as promoting biodiversity within those ecosystems. Pesticides, antibiotics, and plant toxins. Well, most of those are all controlled. You know, we have regulatory processes in place in terms of antibiotic and pesticide use to avoid those. Those are all approved by our regulatory agencies of Health Canada and the CFIA. So we have processes in place that limit the movement of those kinds of compounds into the final meat product. Ethical issues. Well, there is no nervous system in cultured meat, so there is no ability for those meat cells to sense pain. But as we know, in our ethical animal welfare and health is a huge part of what's going on now in terms of our production systems and ensuring that we maintain that. And obviously, those are also connected to the production efficiency. Antibiotic resistance genes. In the laboratory, when we grow these cultured cells, we often add antimicrobials to the culture media to prevent the contamination. So in these large factories that they're talking about, contamination through bacteria or fungi is going, or even viruses could be a major concern. Like viruses are capable of infecting these muscle cells as well. So those are still going to be a huge concern and a big challenge in a fully scaled factory to prevent that contamination from taking place. We can reduce that in the laboratory. We use biohazard hoods and really very strict aseptic techniques, and even in some cases there, we'll add antimicrobials even under those conditions to reduce the risk of contamination with bacteria growing in that we don't want to see there. The spread of zoonotic diseases, it is true that livestock can act as a vector for some diseases that can then be transferred to humans. So as I mentioned, it is possible that viruses can affect these muscle cells, but that's probably one thing that some of the risk would be reduced relative to what we have in complete livestock systems compared to the cultured meat system as well. So what are some of the other disadvantages? Well, dysregulation of the cell lines. Maintaining purity of those cell lines is quite a challenge as well in the laboratory. And those cells divide and replicate, and there can be errors in that replication process as well. The other thing is that these cells, when they're growing within those bioreactors, they don't have an immunity system like a living animal does. So, you know, a lot of the animal depends upon limiting those pathogens as a result of the immune system that it harbors. And these cells, that's one of the reasons why they're so susceptible to contamination, is because there is no immune system. They'll be lacking in vitamin B12 and iron. It would be potentially possible to add those after the fermentation process, but any nutrient additives that you're adding through fortification could not interfere with the efficiency of the cellular division of those muscle cells. And there may be some questions about nutrient bioavailability as well. Often nutrients will influence each other in terms of how well they're absorbed within the digestive tract. And there are some questions within cultured meat that may affect the availability of some of those nutrients as well. And then the challenges with microbial when I talk about the scale-up production to a factory scale. And then there are the social implications. So we're really talking about a reduction in rural communities. Like if we take the livestock off the land, we'll lose that integration with cropping systems and the importance of manure. There's a lot of other products as well, like the wool, the fiber, the leather, pharmaceutical, cosmetics that are derived from livestock that would have to come from other sources. As I sense, this is true factory farming. There could be cultural losses as well, especially in developing nations. Livestock are often part of the religious framework within many of those cultures. Their wealth revolve around that as well. So it's an important part of their farming community. Increased automation, so there's probably going to be less employment in a system like that as well as it's automated. And then consumer acceptability. There's quite a bit of variability in terms of how much consumers accept the material, whether it meets kosher or halal requirements as well as is still under discussion in terms of it would meet those markets as well. So this really just summarizes a lot of what I already said. I think it's important also to realize that livestock use a lot of the bioproducts from the agri-food industry, like distillers grains or barley or grains that fail to meet the market for human consumption. There's a big interest in using surplus or food waste as an additional source that could be used for livestock production as well. And then the maintenance of those grassland ecosystems. Right now, we produce beef from those grassland ecosystems. Really, when you look at human consumption, that's the only form of food that we produce from those ecosystems as it stands now. And if we go to a factory farming-based, culture-based system, then what are we going to do with those grassland ecosystems? And basically, we'll be taking them off the table as a source of providing protein to humanity through that mechanism. So we've got existing infrastructure into both plant or animal-based proteins. Those technologies obviously already exist. The plant-based meat alternatives are rapidly evolving. It remains to be seen how much of the meat-based market that those will replace, but we know that they're definitely more prominent than they were 5 to 10 years ago. And the cultured meat, in terms of producing a product, and then at this point, the cultured meat will never meet the requirements of a vegan or a vegetarian, of which the plant-based meat alternatives do. There's a lot of technologically advancements that we still need in order for cultured meat to reach this anywhere near the same level of diversity and eating quality that we have in the existing cuts that we derive from livestock production. And then finally, is like, how well is that going to be accepted? There's a lot of variability if you look at the consumer surveys. You really can't tell until you put it on the shelf. I think if you looked at the plant-based meat alternatives, the original surveys that they did for that would have suggested that the consumption would be much higher than it actually is right now. So ultimately, the consumer is boss, and they really make that decision. They can answer a survey, but they really make that decision when they reach into the meat counter and they just select whatever protein source they want, and they're prepared to pay for it at the till. And that's always not the same as what they say when they answer a survey. So ultimately, that's the final test in terms of consumer acceptance. So with that, thanks very much, and I'd be happy to try to answer some questions.
Thank you so much, Tim. What a great presentation. So as you mentioned, the floor is now open for questions. Feel free to continue to ask questions as we go along. So I'm just going to ask the first one here from Fred. And he's asking, does the composition of the growth media need to change as the cells grow and mature? What growth factors and hormones remain as residue when the muscle cells are harvested for food?
Yeah, that's a good question. So at this point, there is some changes in cell differentiation in that, where they have to change the types of hormones in that will affect the differentiation of cells. So if you want to get into the more complex meat structures, like when you're talking about trying to produce steak, and then you need the cells to differentiate into connective tissue, vascular networks, etc. Then they need to change up the types of components within the media. When they're just producing the myotubes themselves, they can use that with a pretty standard media formulation, and they don't have to change it between each run. They need to renew it after each run, but they don't need to change it within a run. With regard to, no system is 100% efficient. So if you went in there with a highly sensitive analytical method, you'd be able to detect the original components that were in the media, plus the waste products that were produced at the same time. It's really a matter of how efficient that system is. And obviously, when I talked about some of those plant-based systems and the potential negative impact that might have on efficiency, then you're going to have more nutrients left over after the bioreactor process than what you would with an efficient system. And then it depends on, what level of complexity they're going to make, because you could isolate those components, recycle them, and reutilize those within the next bioreactor run if you were prepared to put the money in that it would take to isolate, characterize, and make sure that you were able to produce a properly defined media in the next run.
Awesome. Okay, so we have a question about the antimicrobials in the media, and is cellular protein being positioned as a way to avoid antimicrobials? And can you elaborate on the use of these antimicrobials and what amounts required would be significant in terms of potential AMR transfer if the final product wasn't cooked properly?
Yeah, so just to clarify, when I talked about the antimicrobials that we would use in the laboratory, that's for experimental purposes and for experiments that we're running. So we have no intention of having that material enter the food chain, nor are we producing it as an alternative protein source either. So that's an entirely different thing. Using antimicrobials for the production of the lab-grown meat here would be a non-starter. That wouldn't be approved. They wouldn't see, Health Canada or the regulatory would not approve that. When we use antimicrobials, as we know, in livestock production, we have very strict standards that we have to comply, right, in order to be able to use those antimicrobials. There's specified withdrawal times, specified dosages, specified livestock for which certain antimicrobials can be used for. All of those regulations have to be followed when we use antimicrobials in livestock production. And at the same time, then, those are all derived from submissions to the regulatory agencies of Health Canada, the CFIA, which review all of those documents and then either approve or not approve the antimicrobial. If the antimicrobial is not approved, then it can't be used for that livestock or that livestock species. So, and then when you consider all those, one of the primary criteria that they're using in that evaluation is the absence of residues in any of the final products that enter the food chain. And so that's one of the requirements. That's why we have the withdrawal times. That's why there's certain limitations on which antimicrobials can be used. And that's why, even at that, they test within the production stream to determine whether there is any antimicrobial residues present. And if there is, then they can condemn that and prevent that product from entering the food chain and give the producer no value for it. So we're not going to see that with regard to in cultured-based meats. They're not going to use, because there's no withdrawal time there, right? That's directly interacting with the tissue that would be harvested and used as the protein source. Also, because, and even at that, so that it's not an issue, but even if we did consider antimicrobial resistance from that perspective, we need aseptic conditions. So basically, there needs to be no bacteria within those bioreactors. So if there's no bacteria, there's no bacteria to become antimicrobial resistant either. But if they have bacteria within those bioreactors, it's quite likely they'll outgrow the muscle cells, and you'll end up growing bacteria instead of muscles.
Thank you, Tim. So our next question is from Reynold, and he's asking, is there any reason to expect that food safety would differ between cultured and natural meat? No cows to carry STEC, but just as easily contaminated, I'd expect.
Yeah, I think, yeah, Reynold, that would be correct. So basically, I don't know if you look into a pharmaceutical plant or that, and you see the people with the hairnets and the suits on and the masks and all that kind of PPE, we call that, right, to try to prevent bacterial contamination. That's the level of caution that would have to be taken within those production systems to prevent bacterial contamination. And so they're going to go in and basically, I'm sure that from a regulatory perspective, those would be evaluated from a pharmaceutical level, or, you know, basically you're producing a product for human consumption, right? So you're going to have to meet those kinds of requirements within those plants. And as I said, contamination of that product could be very easy. Even when you talk about, you know, if we talk about even the likelihood of contamination of hamburger versus a steak, right? If we grind up the meat and we release the nutrients that are within that meat, that also produces an environment that's more favorable for bacterial growth than just the flat surface of a steak. Because the bacteria, if they do come in contact with the steak, they're just on the surface. We throw that on the barbecue, they're exposed directly to that heat source, and as a result, they're killed. So you've got that, but in this case, the nutrient media would be even more rich than what it would be in a hamburger in terms of when you're growing that material.
Awesome. Okay, so our next question is coming from Tom. And he is asking, is it fair to conclude that the threat to animal protein consumption will come from plant-based alternatives versus cellular meat?
Yeah, well, I think at this point that, if we looked at the market and current occupation of the marketplace, that's definitely true. But when I talk too about producing 200 metric tons of meat by 2050, which is, at least a 60% increase of where we are right now, I think there's room for more than one method of producing protein, meat, meat or animal-based protein. And it's going to come down to economics in that as well. These systems now at this point, they're not really economically viable as it stands today. But there's, as I mentioned, a lot of research going in, particularly in the medical community, into this technology. So there's definitely going to be advancements. We've seen those advancements already since cellular meat was first talked about. How far is it going to go? I think that still remains to be seen. But I think there's room in the marketplace, if it's economical, for all of those sources, given the increased consumption that we're projecting. Obviously, in some countries, like cellular meat probably makes less sense in developing nations, where they don't have the capital for investment in factories and the infrastructure and the the energy and transportation and all of that would be required for those kinds of systems. But then you got to question the logistics as well. Okay, so if we're going to establish those factories in developed nations, then are we just going to be marketing cellular meat to the developing nations, or are the developing nations more better off to rely on integrated crop livestock systems, where they get the value of the manure from livestock productions as a fertilizer, which they already recognize, I think, better than the developed nations do in terms of the value of manure, at least in my travels in those regions. So I think those kinds of dynamics need to be considered in the overall picture as well.
Absolutely. All right, so we have a question from Albert, and he's wondering, is there any information yet on eating experience? An example, cellular burger versus beef burger. Like plant-based burgers, do they still need to add ingredients to make them taste juicy and mimic the blood and fat in meat?
Yeah, Albert, that's correct. So the company that I mentioned that just talked about the steak that they have proposed to developed. If you can get a picture, you can see a picture of it on the internet, but I wouldn't really describe it. It looks more like shredded beef, I would say. It doesn't look like hamburger, but it still looks like shredded beef to me. And even in the comments, so this is being released by the company that produced it, is that they felt that yeah, it's a steak, it's multicellular, but it's the eating experience still needs some work. And so if they're admitting to that, then I think definitely when we talk about the texture and that of meat, the intramuscular fat is a big part of that. The degree of tenderness, with that connective tissue that I talked about, the impact that has, those are all big factors. The fat, they could add fat after production, but then if you're going to do that, why not just go directly with the livestock, especially if the burgers, even when you add the fat, is going to be like $12 a pound or more, so yeah, there's still a lot of work to do. I haven't heard anybody say with the cultured meat that it tastes as good as the original livestock derived product. I think the plant-based people are closer to that than actually the cellular cultured people are, and they do that through fortification and in what they mix together in there to produce the plant-based alternatives.
Great. So we have another question here. When could we expect to see ground cell products or muscle products be commercially available in Canada?
Oh, that's a good question. I think I really don't have a good answer for that. These guys are talking about the alternative methods they have to try to lower that cost down. And you never know how far advanced they are. A lot of these are venture capital companies, so they're raising money to develop their technologies. So they're not going to want to talk too much about the challenges. They're going to want to talk about the opportunities, right, to encourage investment and enthusiasm for research in the area. And so I think a lot of that is what's going on. As I mentioned, they already had marketed that one chicken-based product in Singapore in a restaurant there. I haven't heard that that's really expanded much beyond that. The cost is still going to be a factor as well, and it could very well be a chicken-based product before a beef-based product as well.
Okay, thank you. We do have time for one more, maybe two more questions if anybody else has them. So we are just going to give it a couple seconds here and see if any more questions come in. Thank you again, Tim, so much for your time and your ability to answer all these questions. It's been great.
Yeah, no problem. Oh, it's an interesting area, you know, and like I say, with the regenerative medicine, we're going to see, you know, that area is definitely, you don't need additional investment in that area for that science to continue to advance. And it feeds into this cellular based protein as well. So we'll see improvements, you know, how far they can get there that's the question in terms of the economics. And the scale up is another big issue. Those are the two big ones.
Definitely. Okay. It doesn't look like we have anything else coming in. So thank you so much, Tim, and thank you everyone for all of your questions. It is clear that the future of food will need to combine all available protein sources to meet our needs, and cellular grown protein is an exciting possibility, but I think we can all agree that it's not going to replace the role of livestock in our food system, especially here in Canada. So there will be a short survey sent out later today via email. And so we would ask you that you complete the survey to provide us with any important feedback for potential future webinars. If you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to send those via email to feedback@cattle.ca. That is feedback@cattle.ca. We also have developed a fact sheet specific to cellular protein, which is available upon request if you are seeking any additional information. Thank you all again and have a great night.
Thank you.